Today, we're going to be talking about customer and market focus for industrialized construction. And before we get into that, I want to do a short reminder about what we talked about last week. So last week, we talked about platforms in industrialized construction. And if you remember, we talked about how the normal way in construction is that we start with design and we move downstream into future activities, right? So you add more information to your design and your model until you get all the way to the end of the project. We talked about how product platforms enable us to take rules and restraints about assembly or about manufacturing or about configuration and start embedding those into the design space so that we don't design something that can't be later fabricated in an industrialized way. We also talked about projects, processes, and platforms. So you remember some of these. We talked about the differences between them and how they interact with each other. So we talked about how we will always need projects, but we want to put our continuity, our knowledge, our development into the processes and into the product platform. And that leads us to today. So today we're going to move towards thinking about customer and market focus. If you remember our famous wheel here, this is this little segment of the wheel. And let's just talk about first why. Why do we want to do this? It's really important in industrialized construction that we have the right products with the right quality to be produced at the right cost for the end customer and the clients. And this requires us to create better knowledge about the customer's needs, priorities, and expectations. If we're able to do that, then there's the opportunity to strategically divide customers and markets into different segments with specific characteristics. This is nothing new for product development. It's what's done all the time. But then we can use that customer focus to be integrated in design and development of the technical systems and the configuration of buildings. And this last point is something I really want to emphasize. When you're going to make investments in industrialization of construction, these are high capital expenses with very specialized tools. We're not using very general tools like we use that can shape and craft anything how it needs to be done. So if you're going to make those investments, you better be sure that your customer and your market is there. Otherwise, you run the risk of making high capital expenses and not having the flow volume of products that you need to make that money back. All right, so these are the two models that we're going to mostly talk about today, although we'll be dealing with an abstraction of them. And these are two models that I would say they're how do IC firms think about the customer? And these two have been put forward. We'll start, I'll describe this one on the left and this one on the right, and then we're going to get into this one on the right first. But this is a diagram by Lars Hvan and was picked up by Jensen in 2010. That talked about the design entry point for customization. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, we're going to talk about this strategic perspective, which includes two perspectives that you read about in the pre-reading as well. You have your outside-in perspective, which begins by looking at the value proposition and moves towards the resource base. And then you have your inside-out perspective, which starts at your resource base and moves towards your product offering. Those are some fancy words. We're going to get into exactly what I mean by that. So don't worry if that's a little bit too much for you. But we're going to talk about what this means in a business system. And then we're going to abstract these into a 2x2 diagram by the end of class today. I won't get into this in a moment, but I'm going to take those two models. We're going to get into this 2x2 diagram, and you're going to get some practice thinking about where different companies fit on this 2x2 diagram. So let's first talk about the outside in and the inside out perspective. And this is, okay, so if you look here, we have our y-axis here. We're going to be talking about the y-axis first. And it's the same as this, where we can kind of think of outside in versus inside out. So there's two sides of the spectrum. Let's start with the outside in perspective, or this is also called the market-based view. And the basic definition is that you want to analyze the market, you want to find the gaps and create an offer to satisfy the needs. So then you would organize the optimal production system for this market. So in the outside-in perspective, you're really trying to figure out, what is the opportunity here, and then create a specific or select a specific technology or production system to meet those needs. And the example we could use was from last week with Beauclerc. So if you remember, and these are, I think, directly from Beauclerc's website, you remember a little bit about their motivation for how the company started. When they started, they said it must be possible to build good housing for ordinary people with ordinary jobs. And then you have some more concepts here, like how about asking them first and then plan? And this is referring to asking the customers or asking people what they would really be willing to pay, and breaking it into specific price points with a target cost that they then want to deliver the product for. And this was something that I pulled from specifically from their website. I said it was a nurse, but I was wrong. Let me read through. This was the quote about how they started. I want to read it in full. Beauclerc says, when we started planning Beauclerc, we decided to look at some important facts first, such as whom are we building for? What are they able and willing to pay? And how do they want to live? The answer was, we should imagine our buyer being a single preschool teacher with one kid and a small wallet. This family would prefer something bright and roomy, near nature and public transportation. One could say it sounds contradicting, such a good living at such a good price, but we chose to take it on as an inspiring challenge. So this is, you could see Beauclerc really trying to imagine a user persona. We'll come back to that during the lab because Alex will be talking to us about this user persona, and really having a focus to understand who their buyer might be, and emphasizing that market-based view. That's not the only way you could start about innovation or creating a new industrialized construction company. There's a second way, which would be the inside-out perspective, or what I would call, or what has been called the resource-based view. And the resource-based view, the kind of core way I would describe it is that the company's core competencies and capabilities are the starting point. So really that technical knowledge, that expertise is the starting point. And then we want to create a business model based on top of that, right? So I have here an example from the DFAB house, which we haven't spoken too much about, but we've seen a few, I think, slides about this work from the NCCR Digital Fabrication. This is the mesh mold in situ fabricator. The idea here was this was a fundamental research project where they created new competency and capabilities that did not exist before. So an on-site robotics fabricator. Alex was deeply involved with that project, so you can ask him about it. And then now the kind of question, or where the mesh mold is now, as I understand it, is they're trying to think about, okay, now how do we make a business model that can build upon the technical competence that we have? And this is more of a resource-based view. It's really about the competencies within the company, and then seeking out the model that can financially capitalize on this. Another example, and unfortunately we don't get to tour RNA this year, but they're a good example of a timber manufacturer who really have very strong technical competencies around timber fabrication. And if you just go look at their factory, you can really see all of the different technical competencies, the way that Thomas Verle here, you can kind of barely see him in the picture, the knowledge that he has and the way that they invest here. I would categorize them as a very much inside out company. So they have this great knowledge, and then they look for new markets and business models to capitalize on that. Here's another picture. I think I've showed this before of kind of their factory setup. So to summarize these strategic perspectives, we have on two sides. We have the outside in perspective here, which is represented by Beauclerc. And we have the inside out perspective, which maybe would be example of Erne, or we could use the DFAB house and the different technologies being developed at ETH as an inside out perspective example. So the origin of the outside in is this market-based view, and the customer and market perspective is the starting points. And then the inside out perspective, the origin is the resource-based view, and the technical production perspective is the starting points. And where you start from means that the IC company, the industrialized construction company, will be structured differently depending on that perspective of where you start from. Yeah, and so you should, the key point I want you to take away as you even think about your own companies, or we look at other companies, are where do these companies start from, and then what does that mean for the setup of the company? Where do the investments need to be? Where might be the weaknesses be? Now there's a second model here, and Jürgen Lessing from Beauclerc mentioned it last week very quickly, and I'm going to cover it in more detail. is the idea that there are different types of product platforms, systems, and products that exist within the kind of construction world. And it's actually within any type of complex product, but we're speaking specifically about construction. And the way this model works is that there's 4 different levels. I'm going to go through each of those. And here's the design entry point for customization. In other words, it's the point in which the customer enters the conversation or enters the product design. It's the point when the customer starts to interact and customize the product how they would like. This first one is how we normally deal with customization in construction. It's called engineer to order, which basically means when you need a new project, you start from scratch and you will engineer that project exactly how you would like it to be. And the guiding principles for that are norms and standards. So you create a certain set of codes or norms or standards in which these things need to be adhered to. You then engineer each specific project, and then you return back and check to make sure that that conforms to the norms and standards. We'll go through the other ones in just a moment, but you can also think about then on this bottom axis is the finished product specifications. So this is saying, how finished is the product when the customer enters into the process? In the first case, it's not very finished, right? So you can kind of see it's at this point here. So there's still a lot of work to do when the customer starts the kind of design entry point. But as you move over and you go towards more completed designs, you have much less, you have much higher product specifications and much less design decisions to make. I'll go through each in detail, but actually let's go through each one first and I'll come back to that. So in this first one was what I would call traditional design and construction, right? So I mentioned why, but it's not just traditional design and construction. I might argue that something like the mesh mold in situ fabricator also is being engineered to order because it's the first of its kind. And there might not be a lot of norms and standards, but there are still some, and this fabricator has to adhere to it. So this would be, it's kind of still in this area, it might be moving a little bit towards platform engineering, but this is how I would categorize something like that. Then you have, let's see here. Yeah, okay. Then you have this prefabricated, no, every time it's gonna do that because I copied slides, oh well. Then you have your prefabricated building systems. And I would put someone like Erne or Swiss Property in this category where you have kind of a generic platform or a kind of platform design that you like to use, but there's still a lot of customization that can occur. So you have kind of a preferred way to do it. You engineer your platform, but you need to kind of still customize. You still can make some engineering changes for each project as you need. The next one is about mass customization. And we've talked briefly about mass customization. And in 2 weeks, we're going to go in much greater depth about digital platforms for mass customization. But an example of Splash Modular, which will come out, is how do we kind of use configuration engineering so that we really kind of digitally enable people for mass customization with our kit of parts. And this is actually just speaking about Swiss Property. This is the way that they're trying to go. And finally, we have the example of Beauclerk, where it's a full product family. So there's very little customization. And then your decision is just to select variants, right? So you can pick this style or this style. But in Beauclerk's case, every house is the same. They have this lottery and you're just basically picking your location, but and maybe your finishes, but you're not really changing the engineering of the product, right? So it's not customizable really at all. It's a selection of a variant. And then let's see if I go back really quickly. There's a lot. I reordered this a bit. So then we can think about as you go from bottom to top, you have more flexibility, right? So as we exist today, we have lots of flexibility in our systems. We can engineer anything, right? So that's good. We want to have flexibility. But the trade-off is that as you go from top to bottom, you increase the predictability. So Beauclerk is very predictable. They know exactly what they're going to get every time. Whereas if you're here, you have very low predictability and you have to re-engineer each time. So that's the trade-off between flexibility and predictability that's going to exist in these systems. All right. Skipping ahead. Okay, so now what we're going to do is if I would describe these different entry points for customization as engineer to order, Platform engineering is sometimes called made to order or MTO. Configuration engineering is called configure to order or CTO, and select variant is CV. We're going to kind of couple that together with this x-axis here. So now you have engineer to order, that was the top one, made to order, configure to order, and select variant. And now we're going to combine our two graphs so we can kind of look at these different strategic orientations as a whole, right? So now you can start to think about Beauclerk has a select variant and an outside-in perspective, so they are going to end up in the top right here. RNA is somewhere around the engineer to order or made to order, and they have an inside-out perspective, so they're going to end up right here. So if you remember, we've talked about the measuring the 8 sub areas across these different levels. And I just wanted to share these scores for you because you'll use them in the end. If you remember, you get your 20 points to decide between different areas where you're going to emphasize. So if you think about customer and market folk scoring, a score of 0 means the customer is basically anonymous and unknown, right? So you don't put any effort into understanding your customer. You just assume that what you've made is great and they will come to you. The next one is a general insight into the basic customer priorities, equipment preferences, apartment size, examples, a clear perception of who the customer is. A score of 2 means you've done more investigation. You've really tried to understand the customer needs and priorities for different cost levels and customer segments. So then you could think about you have a high-end customer and you create a certain model for them, and then a mid-level, so you have a different model. And this could go into more detail. And then you have a systematic investigation really in detail. And this could include also like a follow-up with tenants, right? So you start to see, this is very much around housing, but you could use it for other, other types of industrialized construction as well. Surveys, how do you like living in this house? What are some improvements that could be made for the next version of the product platform, et cetera. And then 4 is really kind of this customer investigation and follow-up can be integrated with the other areas, right? So you use ICT tools to really make the whole information transparent across the entire process, right? So you'll have to decide later, not now, but later you'll have to decide what level of scoring do you put on customer market focus, or do you put more emphasis on a different area?